Life is about growth. Life is growth. It is a process, and we cannot grow without changing. And we cannot consciously change or choose change without a reference point. Meaning all conscious change starts with a reference point and then locates us or someone or something in relationship with the reference point. And then either moves further away from the reference point if we're trying to change that in that direction, or moves towards the reference point or beyond the reference point, based on the ideal, based on the idea of where beauty, truth, and goodness lies. And so as soon as we decide what beauty, truth, and goodness looks like, we have a concept of the divine. We have a concept of what's more than we are. Now, within any circle, there is an infinite movement, right? We can go infinitely to the left. We can go infinitely to the right. Within any line, you can move infinitely to the right or infinitely to the left. Wherever we are, you can look at it on the dimension of scale as well. There is an infinite number of fractal patterns that are smaller than us, and there are an infinite number of fractal patterns that are bigger than us, right? And that's within a given set. But we can head out conceptually in any and all directions. We're always at the center of the possibility field. And so as soon as we define and shape our sense of the ideal, then we're either moving away from it or we're moving toward it, and we have cut the one into two, right? And the most important cut is the distinction between moving away from the ideal and moving towards the ideal. Now, this suggests that we can look at ourselves, our cult or culture, a philosophy. We can look at anything. We can look at a whole, and we can divide it into two parts. And the most relevant divide is that which is taking us towards our ideal and that which is taking us away from our ideal, which is our current model of beauty, truth, and goodness. Right? We're moving towards and away from what we imagine. We're moving towards the beauty and truth and goodness as we imagine it, and we're moving away from what we imagine to be ugly, crude, undeveloped, base. Right? We're moving from a base state towards something more refined. And we define those ideals, and yet at some level they're an illusion, right? Because you look at the very word base and refined, right? Well, first of all, you don't get the refined unless you have the base. You can't refine nothing. So the refined is dependent on the base. Right? You can look at a metal, for example. Steel is dependent on iron. Now you can say that iron is more base than steel, or steel is more base than gold, for example. You could say that. But if you cannot get one without the other, the distinction is on some level illusionary. Many people who are averse to dirt, for example, oh, that's dirty. Keep that dirt away from me. Keep the dirt out of the house. That's dirty. That's dirty. Oh, your face is dirty, right? Are drawn to orchids, beautiful flowers, so refined. And yet, if you want to grow an orchid, you don't fuss with the flower. You don't grow orchid flowers from orchid flowers. You grow it from roots and mud, right? The orchid flower is refined mud. And if you want more flowers, you don't manipulate the flowers, you don't mist the flowers, you don't fertilize the flowers. You fertilize, you work with the mud, you work with the manure, the fertilizer, and it will create the orchid, the flower, right? And so we have this odd distinction. And the same understanding that we're in a fractal environment. And what that means is that at different scales, roughly similar patterns repeat. And it's useful for getting the message, for understanding and responding to the pattern. It's useful because whether you look at this scale or this scale or this scale, whether you look at the individual, whether you look at the family, whether you look at the cult or culture, whether you look at the species, whether you look at the planet, whether you look at the universe, you find echoes. You find echoes of the same pattern at different scales. So you can see, right, whatever lens you're using to narrow in or open up, you can see important patterns of relationship, of relays, of energy between the individual and the family and the cult or culture, the culture and other cultures, the species and the larger ecology, one planet and other planets. You can see and find the echo no matter what scale we look at. So that's a little bit of context, a little bit of it's an idea or a series of ideas. And running in parallel, as I look at the question of what of Lazaris, what of my relationship with Lazaris takes me towards what is beautiful, good, and true in my eyes, and what of it takes me away? And it's the same pattern, it's the same circle, right? So we take the one, the relationship in this case with Lazaris, and we divide it into two. Those aspects of the relationship that are taking me towards beauty, truth, and goodness, as I imagine those, and those aspects of the relationship that are not, that are taking me away from beauty, truth, and goodness. And I thought it would be insightful, at least for me, to explore that distinction in my relationship with Lazaris. Now, one of the things that, and to look at them from different levels or different angles, right? Because that's another thing that we see, that, there's this wonderful saying, and it actually goes on for about 10 minutes. I'll shorten it, but, two sons come back return to town to see their father, and they break their legs on the way across the bridge. And everyone says, oh, what bad luck. And then the army comes through and conscripts all the able-bodied young men, and these are the only two sons that don't have to go off and die in the war. And everyone says, what good luck. And if you just extrapolate that for 10 minutes, you can find that there are pros and cons to everything, depending on one's point of view. And so I thought it would be interesting to explore how my relationship with Lazaris kind of has some of that dynamic and can be looked at is both positive and destructive and can be maneuverable, from different points of view. Now, one of the areas, and we'll just call this good and evil, in the sense of good being an evolution towards beauty, truth, and goodness, and evil being a regression, a dissociation, a disintegration of that rendition of beauty, truth, and goodness. So one of the things that I've been playing around a lot with is a new model of effort, of struggle. And this is important to me because effort and struggle is playing a major role in my emergence out of depression, for one, through trauma and PTSD, too, and towards greater success, right? And those of you who have been depressed, overwhelmed, traumatized, et cetera, in far more pain than sustainable well-being, may recognize my experience of not wanting to do anything, not wanting to get out of bed, not wanting to go to work, not wanting to push into stress and anxiety in order to get things done. And what I've found interesting is that a routine that I've developed is one of the key things, right? Now, it's interesting on several levels because the degree of difficulty of the routine, like, for example, my routine today is about 25% as difficult as the routine I developed when I was first establishing a relationship with Lazaris. A few years into that relationship. When I was 14, I developed a routine that gradually saw me going from sleeping 12 hours a day and staying up all night and sleeping during the day and being in a fairly depressed and dissociative state while working with Lazaris. And so this was a little bit of a surreal thing, right? Because Lazaris is talking, I'm listening to the elegance of abundance and conquering fear. And I'm listening to, you create your own reality. But my reality is going downhill. And it's bothering me because it doesn't seem to be, I'm not seeing where it's going, right? I'm sleeping more. I'm feeling more and more dissociative. I'm more depressed. I'm less in my body. And I'm doing plenty of listening to Lazaris, reading novels, J.R. Tolkien, et cetera, working with, listening to Lazaris is probably, 30-40% of my life. And it's not working in the sense that, from starting listening to Lazaris, I'm getting more and more dissociative, more and more dissociative. Yeah, this sense of this gap between me and the world out there is just getting bigger and bigger. And so I went and saw an anthroposophical doctor. So, that's a little bit of heritage. My parents were into Rudolf Steiner and Waldorf. And so that's kind of the model, homeopathy, which Lazaris praises very highly. I think Lazaris, in his rating on health and energy continuums and medicine, I forget what the tape is called, but he did a whole analysis of the different spectrum of protocols for medicine. He puts homeopathy and energy medicine way up at the top, and then kind of descends from there. And an anthroposophical doctor usually works with eurythmy, some paradigms around psychology, and also homeopathy. And and in anthroposophy, there's also a little bit similar to Buddhism, but in a more draconian, through a more draconian lens, or a more paranoid lens. The anthroposophical view is that, Christ is in the middle, and then you've got this narrow path, and to the right is Lucifer, and the left is Ahriman. And Lucifer is all about disembodied states and all that. Ahriman is bound up in the body. But, in its broader sense, you could say that it's about finding the middle way, that there's getting lost in your head or lost in your body, or there's, finding your heart, right? And so Christ is in the middle between these two. Bringing Lazaris into my conversations with my kind of anthroposophical homeopathic doctor, did not go down very well. Oh, it sounds very Luciferic, disembodied, channeled entities, So, that didn't look good. On the flip side, Lazaris is saying homeopathy is a, very effective approach. I haven't found it to be so, meaning I've seen several highly reputable homeopathic doctors and seen little or no impact from any of those experiences. And this is just part of, the mystery and, like, what do you do with that? Like, what do you do with that when, the homeopath criticizes Lazaris, but Lazaris praises the homeopath, and the homeopath doesn't actually work. Those are some of the things that an individual is left to, what do you make of that, right? Well, maybe it was the wrong homeopathic doctor, right? But what about the other one and the other one, right? Are they all wrong? And on what level, right? It's just, what it is. But the homeopathic doctor said, Dane, you need a routine. You're staying up all night. You're not in school. I dropped out in part because I found things like Lazaris more interesting than what I was learning in high school. I couldn't see much application of much of what I was learning in school with any probable future. I even interviewed my teachers at the West Vancouver Waldorf School. I interviewed my math teacher, for example, and I said, name a single time in your practical life when you've used any of this. And the only thing he said was, well, I'm being paid to teach you. In other words, so he learned math in school, never used it a day in his life, and then he's getting paid to teach me something that unless I become a math teacher, I may never use a day in my life. I said, that's a pretty weak argument for the amount of effort that we're, putting into this. It didn't have any answer, right? I mean, and I went through subject by subject, analyzing each one and saying, when is any of this relevant? And the best they could do was to say that I would need a high school diploma. Meaning I was supposed to do all this irrelevant stuff in a very inefficient way so that I could get a high school diploma. And the only reason I would need that was so that I could go to college, where I would do more stuff that might or might not be relevant. The only reason I would need that was so that someone would give me a job that didn't have anything to do with what I had studied in many cases. And that just seemed like an incredibly inefficient waste of, more than a decade to do this that didn't matter so that I could do that didn't matter so that I could do that. Not much better than if I had just jumped to trying to do that well, whatever that was, right? There's plenty of people that major in this and then go do something completely different. And they're not as talented as if they had just jumped to that and spent that decade doing and practicing that, right? So the whole thing, didn't work. And so, but back to, but I hadn't figured out what was better. And I didn't have any clear effort. And Lazaris' focus on, with little or no effort at all, and you create reality and the consequences. So I wanted to create a reality where I left high school and didn't have any particular structure, but it worked out wonderfully. But instead, I left high school and was entering a dissociative state. So I was creating the reality, but I wasn't creating the result, the state that I wanted to feel in that reality. And the anthroposophists dismissed all that. They said, no. You need a routine. The time you get up, the time you eat lunch, and this was news to me because Lazaris, who was the highest being in the all this and highest resonance to ever touch the planet and all that. Lazaris wasn't talking about needing a routine, right? Lazaris was talking about going to the room of beliefs, and I was doing that. And although that wasn't working very well, right, I was just listening to more, tapes and relatively isolated. Right? Lazaris wasn't saying anything about being relatively isolated, and I wasn't getting much exercise, and Lazaris wasn't talking much about that either. But this anthroposophist was talking about the need for routine and, to do things at a certain rhythm. So I thought, well, the Lazaris path of listening to more and more tapes, one, isn't leading to that, and two, isn't working. Meaning I'm descending into a dissociative depressed state. So I picked a routine. And it wasn't easy. It was fragile. What I mean by that is I had this sense of just being surrounded with infinite possibilities and, that were too big and complex to integrate and make sense of. And so it just felt, there's all this stuff out there, all these possibilities. And holding on to one thing, why? Like, what was the thing that would say, no, now's the time to cook dinner and now's the time to go to sleep? Why? Right? What was doing that? I created all this and that. It's all, a matter of your beliefs. Why focus on this routine just to create a routine, right? I didn't get it, right? But the philosophical doctor got it. And I clung to it, right? I wrote down a routine. It started out being pretty basic. I'm going to cook breakfast at this time. I'm going to eat breakfast at this time. I'm going to brush my teeth. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. and I created a routine. And energy level went up, right? Enjoyment of life went up. Self-confidence went up. A sense of agency and control went up. And I continued to refine this routine where I went from, sleeping 12 hours a day at night or during the day, and sleep and waking up 12 hours in the evening because it was quieter. I enjoyed doing my Lazaris meditations and stuff. I went to waking up in the day and going to sleep in the evening and eating regularly, and then doing this and then doing this and doing this. And I eventually had roughly 30 items on my routine every day. 10 minutes of this, 10 minutes of journaling my thoughts, 20 minutes of poetry, 20-minute nap, writing my dreams for 20 minutes, waking up at this time, doing yoga for 20 minutes, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the Sunday, I built in working with goals and things like that. So that was my daily routine. And it led to a 400% increase. I would say actually a 500%. And as I think about it, that may be conservative, meaning we may be up at 700%, but let's just say it's a 500% improvement in productivity. And what do I mean by that? Well, I wrote 5,000 poems during the years of that 20-minute poetry routine. I filled out multiple, journals of thoughts and feelings and choices. I achieved thousands of daily goals. I moved my sleep from 12 hours a day down to 5 hours a day very happily, and had more energy than with the one. It was, I felt excited, alive, etc. I grew. I studied biographies. It was definitely a 500% increase in productivity and learning about myself and getting things done. Maybe, and it probably is more likely 700%. But it was also like a 400% improvement in well-being. I wasn't in this existential place of what should I do next, with an endless horizon, with no appointment, nothing out there. Just, I guess the main choice was which novel to read and which Lazaris tape to listen to, right, at that time. Have I eaten enough? Should I eat at 3 a.m, 5 a.m, whatever, just no structure, nothing. And so through this routine, without changing a single belief, just the one thought, and followed by the choice that maybe this routine thing could work. Tremendous benefit. Now, the criticism that I have about Lazaris is, having listened to the tapes where Lazaris talks about being more than human and that seeing more clearly than human beings, my assumption was that I was going to ascend, so to speak, from a dissociated, depressed state by following Lazaris. Not by going and talking with a homeopathic doctor who didn't have the higher levels and all that, right? That's not what happened, though, right? I would do the room of beliefs over and over and over again to try and mitigate the trauma of my parents' divorce and all the various things going on with my siblings, and little or no impact at all. But this routine, right, just having a tremendous amount of impact. And so, I think that if we look at it technically, someone I'm buying some land from at the moment was inviting me to look at the land from Google Earth. And you can get down to like a 500 6-foot view, right, where you get blurry this and that. I said, no, no, no. I don't want to see an overview of the land. I want a video of walking in through the gate. Well, that's not a higher level view. It's a down on the ground view. I want to see what this looks like from a video camera walking in the gate. Make me a 5-minute video of that. It's far more useful in deciding whether to add that to the land purchase, this other property, right? So I want a more human scale angle. In other words, sometimes Google Earth can give a better understanding, and sometimes the video on the ground. Well, on a more broader, or if you take that out in a fractal way and look for that on a psychological level, sometimes you get insights from a channeled entity that you cannot see on the ground, but just as often you get insights on the ground that you can't seem to get from a channeled entity. Now, this is great if it's understood, if it's transparent, and if there's a filter for deciding when do you want a human perspective and when do you want a drone perspective. When do you want a therapist's insight and when do you want a channeled entity's insight, right? So what would be, and if we understand that reality is fractal, which just means that there are similar dynamics that are all slightly different that replicate themselves over and over and over again throughout reality, right? So you can, for example, learn how to build a profitable investment account by studying trees, because reality is fractal, right? If you understand that, you can study skyscrapers from planting trees too. What does a tree do? It sends down roots that are as deep as its branches. If you're to pull a tree up and look at it, it's got a canopy underground that mirrors its canopy above ground. And that's why it works, right? That if the tree just grew up, it would fall over. That if you just started building a skyscraper, the slightest breeze would topple it over. Skyscrapers begin by going down and down. And you can learn that by studying trees, right? Because reality is fractal. So when do you want an overview? When do you want to look from a bird's eye view? And when do you want to look at the ground? Well, if you're trying to look at very big patterns, you need to step back big enough to see the pattern. For example, Ray Dalio, in some of his brilliant historical work on the rise and decline of nations, is shedding light on the fact that, for example, there's a very interesting pattern. If you look at the Roman Empire to the present day, where currently the United States is the dominant world power, in his book and video on YouTube, The Changing World Orders and Patterns Around That, is going to say this much more thoroughly than I will. But you can find, for example, that in the rise and decline of empires, you see a pattern like this, and that the rise and the decline rarely lasts more than 300 years. That very often there's maybe a 100-year period where one country, whether it's the Dutch and the Dutch guilder or the British and the British pound, the Japanese, the Romans, the Chinese, right now the Americans, that the pinnacle, when the world order is defined, in this case by the US, with the dollar being the dominant currency, that it rarely lasts for more than 100 years. In this case, we ascended after World War II, so 1950 began the ascent, and it kind of peaked somewhere in the 80s, 70, 70, whatever. It's peaked, and now it's on the decline. And what Ray did was studied the pattern and why it happens. And it boils down to, on some level, this, that people who are unusually hungry, people who are in an unusual amount of pain and frustration, get very clear through that pain, through that frustration, and sometimes through envy and setting their sights on a competitor. For example, the British watched the Dutch, and the Dutch built better ships, they had better technology, and so they had a better trading system, so they made more money, so their money was more popular and valuable, and they had more trade, so they basically worked harder and had better technology. So this very tiny country becomes a world epicenter. Holland is not a very big country, right? So the British watched this, and what happened with the Dutch was they became opulent and lazy, and they raised their children to be opulent and lazy. And the children were not hungry. They weren't motivated to find the next thing. They were enjoying the luxury. And whenever you have a wealthy country like that, everyone wants to loan them money because they're a good bet. And so the country usually gets sunk in debt as its productivity and technology declines relative to hungrier countries. And their debt levels increase because everyone will loan them money at a lower interest rate than they'll loan money to anyone else. The subsequent generations become more entitled and less in touch with reality. They'd start living off the debt rather than increasing their productivity and technology. Meanwhile, the hungry countries copy the best of the leader and go beyond it. And they're cheaper. Their people work cheaper because rich kids don't want to work doing dishes for $2 an hour. A hungry country will, right? Rich kids don't want to work and then go to school afterwards. It's too much work, right? Let's let it be easy, right? So they don't, right? So statistically, this pattern of, roughly 100 years, sometimes 300 years, boils down to the fact that hardworking, competent people create wealth that leads to the entitlement and laziness of the secondary generations, that leads to higher debt, the temptation of debt that is accepted, the addiction to debt, and then the decline, and then another empire rises. And this has been going on, indefinitely, right? So Ray talks about this, and of course, it makes sense. And so you have this same dynamic within countries, that a leader, rises up, etc., and then becomes comfortable. And often it's a hungrier, more motivated engineer at the bottom of the company, etc., that can do better work, than a cushy leader, right? That starts to sit on their laurels. Well, this is an important principle to understand, and the United States is currently in a decline as China, as the United States is coming down, and China at the same time is rising, and the crossing has occurred, and we can expect to see the Chinese be the dominant power in the next 100 years, and then they will decline in 100 to 300 years for the exact same reason that every empire has declined before. Right? Opulent spending, overconfidence, lack of innovation, apathy to innovate, and then another country that's particularly given an edge by being oppressed. Because dishonored, violated parts of the psyche often develop anger and hostility that becomes an edge, and dishonored countries often become motivated to overthrow the oppressor, right? So this is a cycle, right? So there's all these fractal patterns going on in different ways. And it's good to know if you understand the cycle that you're on. Now, Ray Dalio has a very deterministic point of view, meaning he says on one of his books that, in his opinion, if we had a supercomputer that could truly track the causal correlations between everything in reality, that the future would become more and more deterministic through that lens, meaning that where we are today is a scientific byproduct of where we were yesterday and the day before and the day before that, and that the future that is emerging can be predicted with greater and greater clarity if the model of reality is complex enough and the compute power is powerful enough. So Ray is profoundly deterministic. Now, what he says is because none of us has the compute power, we should not be deterministic in our outlook, meaning we, with a very low level of compute power and a very small subsection of data, need to be humble to the fact that there's a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know that we don't know, and that we don't know that we don't know that we don't know. And that those things are much bigger than what we know. And so if we pretend that we know for certain what's going to happen, we're almost certainly going to be wrong, or at least 50% of the time, because there's so much that we don't know that we don't know. And so while he believes reality is deterministic, he believes that our approach to reality requires profound humility due to an absence of data and an absence of compute power, right? So you get the two extremes. You get profound humility and a belief in determinism. Now, Ray is considered to be one of the best investors of all time, along with Buffett, along with, I forget the name of the other guy, but Ray's run one of the most effective hedge funds by going into the past. Now, Lazaris says the past has ended unless you create a future based on the past and then create the present out of the projected future based on the past. But otherwise, it's ended, right? Well, Lazaris also says all beliefs are true, so pick the beliefs that work, right? Buffett and Ray Dalio are the antithesis of Lazaris, right? Buffett doesn't say you create your own reality and you create the consequences, right? That if you want to pick a winning stock, you just pick it, and then you create whether or not that stock makes money or not. You create the reality, and then you create the consequence of reality. Instead, Buffett or Dalio will say, no. There are patterns, and if you select and filter better than other people for those patterns and find yourself on those patterns and have a higher probability of predicting the future based on a more effective model of those patterns, that you will be more successful at predicting the future than other people, right? So which ones work, right? Well, to my knowledge, there isn't a Lazaris investor in Buffett's or Dalio's league. But there are Buffett's and Dalios in Buffett's and Dalio's leagues. And so it's, I remember Penny talking about Buffett being pretty much done for. It was all about the new tech stuff. And eBay and all of that, right? Well, statistically, Buffett has done better than the majority of individuals, around that time. It was around the 2000 period. And then, of course, we had the tech crash, right? Buffett warned about the tech bubble, and Penny, Buffett's old hat, old school. It's about the new thing, right? But what works, right? Buffett isn't getting incredible returns, rather mediocre, because he's got so big. And there you have another thing, like if you're successful, lots of people want to put money into your fund. The more money that gets put into your fund, the bigger your deals have to be. The bigger your deals have to be, the harder it is to differentiate from the mean, right, from the average. And, so the more successful your reputation, the more money you have, the harder it is to beat the market, because you become the market. If you are, like, imagine an investor that had so much confidence that everyone only wanted to be invested in that investor, that every single person on the planet put all their discretionary money into that investor, right? Then either half of the economy collapses because nobody's investing in the weaker stocks and the weaker companies, but then too much money has to then go into the other companies and it raises the price, right? There's no one to sell, right? When you're buying, there's no one to sell if you're the only one, right? So you have this dynamic where by being super successful, you become mediocre as an investor, right? And so meanwhile, a small, lean investor that just has 10,000 to invest, they can double their money easily, right? Because there are lots of opportunities to double your money for 10,000. There aren't in a month, in a year, right? But there aren't as many opportunities to double $500 billion in a year. Like, where's the act quick and put in $500 billion and then this happens, right? Because when you sell $500 billion, it crashes the market that you made by putting it in, right? So sure, you can buy 100 million of something, you can buy another 100 million, you can buy another 100, and you can raise the price by changing the supply and demand dynamic. But as you exit the market, the same is true, right? You sell 100 million, there's ready buyers. You sell the second 100 million, and people demand a lower price. And so you just collapse the market as you leave if you're big enough. So, but these are, these are data points in our reality. The anthroposophist helps me 500% more than Lazaris helps me, while being critical of Lazaris. Right? But Lazaris talked about the benefits of homeopathic medicine practiced by anthroposophical doctors, right? So there's all these interesting patterns. The pattern that I'm working with at the moment having collapsed into more pain about 6 years ago by a 500% margin than I'd ever experienced in my life or knew to be physiologically possible. I began to find myself in a very tight room where stepping a few inches to the left or the right, the pain became so unbearable. My life was defined by the fear of unbearable pain. And we all have a pain tolerance, meaning there is a point on the infinite pain continuum where the pain gets too big not to be the primary priority to avoid. And as I remember my efforts, right? Because the pain was way up here, and I said, oh, I need to have goals. And I would start, and I'd be like, I can't take 2 steps without searing. I mean, forget goals then, that's too painful. I need to protest this, right? And well, so this kind of protest is too painful. I need to ask for help. No, asking for help and being rejected in this level of pain is worse than freezing and not asking for help, right? Being rejected in this level of pain is too fucking painful to do again and again, right? So I began realizing that I'm in a pretty small box, and I've got to discover how to maneuver in the box without re-traumatizing myself with terror at the sheer intensity of physiological and psychological pain. And Lazaris was not my friend in this state. Pizza was my friend as an anesthetic. Thailand was my friend as an empathic country. Sleep dissociation, creating synthetic jet lag by constantly changing my sleep pattern so that I felt 50% dissociated, which reduced my pain by 50% because that's mostly what was there. That was my friend. So I compulsively moved around in such a way that created psychological distraction and chaos, etc., so that I could function. And I had a very tiny window to function initially. And so I would have maybe 30 minutes a day initially, and I gradually worked it up, right? And so right now I've got that up to maybe 5 hours where I can do a certain amount of things within that 5 hours and still function. Other things are too painful, so I only have 30 minutes of that, right? And so I, began to, analyze what I could and couldn't do and why, and build on the possibility field and the probability field that I could do. A little bit the way I worked on my sleep routine, because I couldn't just go straight from sleeping 12 hours a day down to 5. Now, that was done an hour to a half hour at a time in increments, not more than an hour ever, reducing sleep at any one time. And as I got closer to, below 8 hours, it was half-hour increments. And then it was half-hour increments and adding in a nap, right? And the 5 hour or 4.5 hours worked if I had 2 20-minute naps spaced very precisely, right? So it became more delicate. You can think of John D. Rockefeller Sr. at Standard Oil, when he went around and was refining the system. He would go to the soldering person who was putting lead solder on the cans of oil, and he'd say, how many drops of solder are you using, around there? And he said, 32. So Rockefeller said, try 30. Cans held up. So Rockefeller said, try try 29, right? And the cans, didn't leak oil, right? And so he said, try 28. But by 27, it was leaking oil. And so he went back up to 28, 29. But at some point, if you peel away something, the system, the structure collapses, right? You can shave away on the bone structure of a human body, but at some point, the bones become too brittle and the body collapses into, a blob of flesh with no structure, right? And so I was looking at, the edges of how much sleep could I take away without a breakdown in the structure, in the psychological structure. And that would actually yield more energy. Because at, for example, 5.5, 6 hours plus a 20-minute nap, I was twice as energized as I was when I was sleeping 12 hours with no nap. Right? But those are kinds of things that, for example, didn't work here because there, in some ways, I was heightening awareness of something that was relatively pleasurable. I found Lazaris pleasurable at the time. I found writing poetry relatively pleasurable. I found listening to the BBC World Service pleasurable at the time. And so those were all kind of in writing and doing this and that. And yoga was pleasurable. And so I was, I was awakening more into a reality that I could tolerate rather than into something that was overwhelmingly painful without the ability to navigate it, to adjust towards it, right? And so a routine, again, became quite useful. Now, at some point in the process, I added the morning meditation into the routine. But listening to Lazaris talk about creating your own reality, etc., was definitely allergic. It was a disgusting thing to hear, right? Get that, oh God, how disgusting. But the morning meditation, right, proved to be, I wanted to meditate once a day, and that seemed to be the most reliable. It was almost as good as having my dog cuddling me every morning, right? So my dog came first, and my dog helped me get up, right? I didn't want to wake up, but my dog eased the transition into, it's a little bit like, the watching any of the rocketry at SpaceX, recently, you'll find that there's a point called maximum dynamic pressure, max Q, and they always throttle the rockets down when going through that terrain so that they're not adding to the maximum pressure, they're slowing down at the point where the load is highest on the structure. And the point for me that was highest on the structure was getting out of bed, right? And so my dog was a pleasurable thing to want to wake up into my body. I didn't want to wake up into my body without a dog. But with the dog was pleasurable enough to want to reach out and pet the dog and to want to hold the dog. But that's taking me into my body, but it's rewarding me with pleasure. Now, once I'm through that threshold where I'm somewhat awake and want to be awake in this moment, then transitioning from that moment to getting out of bed and doing things is and was something that was doable and pleasurable from that perspective, right? And then it would pivot into doing the morning meditation, and later to then a breathing meditation. Yoga didn't work, right? That was painful. It's still painful. Yoga is still painful, so I'm not doing yoga. But it's a continuum. And, the thing that I would say around change and growth is a couple of things. One of them is that, a giant leap forward, right? A whole new paradigm. This is very popular in the New Age. The new paradigm. They've even stopped calling what's new about it, right? It's just whatever it is, it's new. Newer than what, right? What was the last one that you had last week? No, this is the new paradigm. The new paradigm. The shift from what to what? Doesn't matter. Whatever it was, we're shifting from that, right? Because more is better and faster is better and more evolved is better. Well, you may or may not have listened to Jane Roberts talking to Seth, and then Seth 2, right? And so Seth said that, Seth 2 was to Seth what Seth was to Jane Roberts and people reading the book. So you listen to Seth 2, and it's not as engaging. It's not as meaningful as, as Seth, right? So it's beyond, but it's breaking down that idea that more is always better. And you can kind of see that practically where you've got two vantage points, right? So you can see the voyage of your life. It's got an arc to it. So if you look up from, this perspective here, you can see the whole arc. But is that useful? If at the very beginning of your life, when you're crawling out of your crib, you just see the whole arc, and you know where it's ending and all that, is that useful? If you understand all the different steps, even Lazaris has said at one point, because if you followed Lazaris long enough, and although Lazaris says they aren't a teacher, they aren't a guru, they just monologue a lot and say that they're more than, and do what they want to do when they want to do it in the way they want to do it, and you take it or leave it, right? So it's whatever you call that, that's, what Lazaris has and is continuing to do. We do a workshop on this subject at this time, at this location, for this price. You show up or not. Well, I call that following, right? Because Lazaris is not saying, hey, where do you want us to show up at what price and talk about this? That would be Lazaris following or in a dialogue, right? So Lazaris is doing what Lazaris is going to do, and other people can follow that or they can not, right? But that, it's kind of, we're going here for vacation. If you want to be friends, come along. But that's where we're going. And so in my, following of Lazaris and where he's going and all these places and ideas, you notice that it started out where all problems were the thing were self-pity or self-importance, right? And if you could just stop having self-pity and self-importance, then all your problems would be solved. And then there was fear, and then there was guilt, and then there was pain, and then there was shame, and then there's shame 2, and shame 3, and then there's the dark law, and then there's, and at some point, I think healthily, Lazaris says, well, why didn't we just tell you, back in 1975 or whatever, that, then there's this, and then there's that, and then there's this, and then there's that, and then there's this, and then there's that, and go on for the next week talking about all the reasons why, after doing all those things, you're still in pain, still in shame, still in blah, blah, blah. And he said, it'd be overwhelming, right? So we start and say it's here, and then we expand it, and then we expand it, right? But it's a pretty long list, right? 300 titles later, with the vast majority of Lazaris friends dealing with shame, pain, frustration, and not much greater success than any other excellent group of people who haven't worked with Lazaris. it becomes how, is there really a correlation between all these things that Lazaris says work and any kind of objective metric? Because the calmest, happiest people I've met have not been Lazaris friends. The wealthiest people I've met have not been Lazaris friends. The most kind and compassionate people I've met have not been Lazaris friends. The healthiest people I've met have not been Lazaris friends. It's just, it's not clear, what's differentiating the demographic of someone who's spent 10, 20, 30 years or 10, 20, 30, 100,000, whatever, on concept synergy services. It's not clear where the differentiation is statistically. Right? The best run businesses in the world are not run by Lazaris friends. The best conversationalists, often terrible conversationalists, are, Lazaris friends. Like, well, Lazaris says this, and Lazaris says that. Lazaris says, that's not a great conversation, right? So, any more than, the Seventh-day Adventists. Want to have a great conversation with a Seventh-day Adventist who's trying to teach you the word of Jesus, etc. So what's the line? And where is Lazaris helped and where have they not helped? And I think that's really, the most interesting question to me at this time, and it's not a conversation that I can have with friends of Lazaris, right? But I should say, it's not a conversation I can have with friends of Lazaris, meaning I've never met the friend of Lazaris that enjoyed this conversation and still appreciated the gifts of Lazaris, because I think that's important. There's anti-Lazaris, and I think that's a little silly, because would the world really be a better place if Lazaris had never come along? Well, I'm sure for some people, in the way that they've related with Lazaris, that could be the case, right? But statistically, overall, I prefer a life with more variety and more possibility. And Lazaris is variety and possibility bigger than no Lazaris, right? I mean, I'd rather a world with channeling existing amongst the possibility than no channeling. And I'd rather a world in which more channels that are distinct existed than one channel. Because that expands the possibility field. And I've met plenty of people that have a favorable impression of Lazaris, and I've met people that are critical. It tends to be very strongly polarizing. Either Lazaris is the next best thing and the most wonderful, and that's normal. I mean, the Buddhists think the Buddhists are the best thing, and Allah, the Muslims think Allah is. So, it's whatever you're into somewhat requires you to believe that that's the best thing, right? Only, no fool says that I'm absolutely sure that Jesus is the best thing, the highest Lord, blah, 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 but I'm going to go be a Buddhist. I think Jesus is the best thing, but I'm going to choose the worst thing. No, I mean, nobody does that. So whatever people choose, they at least believe it's best for them, and people being somewhat egocentric, well, then they believe it's the best, period, right? Because how could it be that something was the best for them and wasn't the best thing for everyone else? And so there is whatever it is you believe, usually polite society dictates that you don't espouse your thing. But if people get comfortable and you ask them, what's the really big, right thing? Well, the word of Jesus, Allah, it's the only thing. So everyone believes that their thing is the best thing. but it's also, that becomes very self-referential because once you, first of all, you have to start deciding what you believe is the best thing, right? So let's say you decide Lazaris is the best thing. Well, the only reason you would buy Lazaris tapes and do this is that you think there's at least a chance that it's the best thing. So you buy a Lazaris tape. If you think it's absolute certain that it's not the best thing and that there are better options, you don't buy a Lazaris tape. So, why would you? There's way more books out there than you have time to read. Why would you not read the best thing? So you think there's a chance this could be the best thing. Could be something there, right? And so you buy a tape, whatever. Now, you've now invested in the belief that it might be the best thing. Now, if you're wrong, right? If you're wrong, and you've just spent $24.99 or whatever it is or was, and it's not the best thing, then you made a mistake, right? And who wants to make a mistake? So if you buy Lazaris thing, you're more likely to say, I was right. This is good. I chose it. It's good. So then, if I chose it and it's good, what's the logical thing to do? Buy another Lazaris tape. I want the best. I'm right. That was the right thing. And so now you've got $50 invested. And do I want to be wrong? Like, I listened to that whole tape, and I thought this was the right thing. And then I bought another one. It talked about being a non-physical and all this stuff, and I thought, yeah, makes sense to me. So I bought another one. Now, do I want to say I could be wrong about that it was complete horseshit, but I was so dumb I didn't catch it after 3 hours, so I spent more money. Meanwhile, my friends are off doing this and this. No, right? So I'm right, and this is the best thing, and so what's the logical thing to do? Buy another Lazaris tape, right? And, and it takes some time to check stuff out because Lazaris may say getting rid of self-pity and self-importance will end all your problems, but easier said than done, right? And if you fail, it's not because Lazaris's techniques don't work, it's because you have payoffs for failing. And now you have to discover where those payoffs are. They're in the subconscious, right? Or they're this, and then you have to discover, well, what do you do with it? Well, now you have to buy that tape, right? So this naturally spirals in, where, the idea that you're spending all this time and money following this particular trail is leading nowhere, or that other people who are listening to Buddha, whatever, getting much better results than you, that's not very pleasant to hear, right? So maybe they're not sophisticated enough to understand, why this is the right thing. And then if you ask another person who's spent 20 years buying Lazaris tapes and doing this, and you say, was all that a complete waste of time? Were you a fool? Was there lots of other better ways of growing out there, but you didn't find any of them? And you've been going round and round with Lazaris for 20 years. Oh, no. Lazaris is the best thing out there, right? Oh, that's good. So they've got 20 years of experience. And it's, and they're more certain than I am now, right? So in 20 years, I'll feel that way too, right? So we go round and round again, right? The real people, the want to do the real work, right? They're, no one you get to know, right? And if you're spending more and more time in this particular loop, the people you're meeting are in that loop. And if you're asking them questions, they've spent more time in the loop than you have, or you wouldn't ask them. Like you don't go to if you've been working with Lazaris for a year, you don't say, "Oh, you've only been working with Lazaris for a day." What do you think? How can I learn from you? No, you go to someone who's worked with Lazaris for 20 years. And are they going to say, oh, this is hogwash? I started off dealing with self-pity. I felt guilty. I'm always doing that now. I feel bad that I have self-pity, and I feel sorry about that. And then I also try and medicate that with importance because I'm working with Lazaris, and they're not, and all this stuff. And my friends are teasing me because they're doing this and that. I remember when I was talking with Lazaris about Lazaris as a teenager, the people around me would say, you can come, but don't bring Lazaris, right? Don't, if you want to come, don't talk about Lazaris. And so on some level, it's a self-referential dogma, right? You create your reality. This is the way it is. And if you believe that, then you can see elements of that. You can find it. You can find a fair amount. Lazaris in a side comment, said that all beliefs are true. So pick the ones that work, and the ones that work for what, right? So the belief that a routine suggested by an anthroposophical doctor worked 5-10 times better than the belief that going into the room of beliefs and finding a belief and changing the belief would work, right? Because I did that and nothing happened, and I shifted a routine and my life got 500% better. So that's the belief that worked, right? But I didn't find it from the highest resonance to ever touch the planet. What do you do with that? Well, a lot of these things, there's no answer. It's not like just because I would say, well, here's the answer, that means anything. Do I know? Do you know? But it is it's painful, meaning for me, I find this kind of thing going round and round and not getting anywhere. I find it painful. Why? I used to find this same dynamic around Christianity. Well, maybe God said this because he meant that, and he didn't mean that, and that's why you shouldn't be a homosexual. Maybe, right? It'd be kind of nice if God, the all-powerful, all-knowing, could get on a telephone, wouldn't it? And ask him. To him, right? He knows everyone. Wouldn't it be nice if he picked up the telephone? 000 God, right? That'd be nice. No. Maybe he's not doing that because you need to have faith in him. Maybe. Be nice if we could clarify that bit too, wouldn't it, right? Or maybe it's all hogwash, right? Maybe. But, right, the all-present, all-powerful, whatever, can't manage a conversation, right? And to some extent, the same is true with Lazaris. Less so, obviously. Lazaris is talking daily, not in an ancient book. But it is 99% monologue, right? 1% of Lazaris friends have spoken to Lazaris 1% of the time. So of all the friends who have ever heard of Lazaris, only 1% have actually had an interaction with their friend. And of them, Lazaris has talked 99% of the time to their 1%. Like, if you look at a typical Lazaris relationship with a long-term friend, they've listened or consumed maybe 1,000 hours of Lazaris monologue, or even dialogue, 5% of the time. but they've spoken less than an hour. What they've said to Lazaris, if you add up the minutes where they're speaking, is less than an hour, 1,000th. It's not a dialogue. It's a monologue, except for that 1%. And so it gets to the same thing. Well, look, maybe Lazaris is doing this because of this and because of that. Maybe, but it's the same dynamic. From a presence that states that they have an unlimited amount of time, they're just choosing to only channel this one time, and that they're a we, but they're just choosing to only channel through Jach, creating unnecessary and artificial scarcity while professing unlimited abundance. Why? Why not channel through 1,000 people, half of them women, some of them black, some of them Asian, in multiple languages? Why not? Well, maybe. It's just unsatisfying, right? So I got tired of the maybes, and other things worked better, right? Brian Tracy taught me salesmanship and entrepreneurship 10 times better than Lazaris. Right. Other people taught me goal setting better than Lazaris. Different specialists in my field mentored me in various subsets of expertise 10 times better than Lazaris. Dance schools taught me to move and enjoy my body 10 times better than Lazaris. Relationship and sexuality schools taught me about relationships and sexuality 10 times better than Lazaris. And all of this was more fun, more successful, and more effective by 1,000%. And this just didn't fit my model of Lazaris techniques work. It's all about you create your own reality. And so why wasn't I creating Lazaris teaching me all these things? And we're a friend, we're not a teacher, we're just going to teach you and charge you for friendship. Why was Lazaris doing that? Right? Maybe, right? So, that got tiring when I began to discover, wave upon wave upon wave of success at 1,000% margin relative to sitting in my room listening to the Lazaris tapes and trying to change the beliefs and all this. It's like, what have I been doing? And this cannot be brought up, unfortunately, right? Because it's threatening in a cult, right? And a cult just means that, there are certain unquestionable habits and thoughts. You can't, as a 10-year-old, long Lazaris friend, have a serious discussion about maybe Lazaris isn't real in the Jach and Lazaris forum. Right? But you can talk about how Lazaris has just completely changed your life. It's wonderful. Everything's perfect. And I discovered this and I learned this. Now you can talk about that, but not this, right? Because that's what makes a cult. Certain things can be repeated by as many people as want to repeat them, but you can't do this. Now, this is no different from the cult of America, right? You can spend 8, 10, 16 hours a day in America pursuing money, and that's fine. But it's illegal to talk about communism, right? Locked up, you can't get a job, right? Despised, right? Anti-American activities, right? So a cult, and every culture has, its root word is cult. And the cult just means that that there's an immune system that protects certain patterns embodied by the majority, and that the immune system kills off deviation, butchers it, shames it, runs it out of town, kills it. refuses to fund it, pretends it doesn't exist, doesn't give it credibility, doesn't honor it. A cult is just a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that is sanctioned by the cult. It gets rewarded. Oh, good, good. Now, this person just said, how are you? Now, the thing to say is, I'm fine. Thank you. Good. You're learning English. That's what we say in this cult. You don't say, I'm miserable and depressed and I don't know why. Why? Because that's not the thing to say in this particular cult. Right? The thing to say is, I'm fine, thank you. Right? Well, what does that mean? Don't. That's the thing to say in this situation. And this is the thing to say in this situation. Right? When someone says, are you successful? Right? You don't say yes. You don't say this, I'm successful, or I've got $2 billion, or whatever it is. You say, well, I was fortunate enough to make some early investments in Uber and Twitter and Facebook. I'm not doing too badly. Oh, that's the thing to say, right? And you don't say, I'm very excited about being able to have sex with as many women as possible. It's amazing, right? You say, well, let's just say it's not too hard in Okinawa to find company, if you know what I mean, right? Oh, very good, right? You said there's a lot of loose, attractive women who want to have sex with you, but you didn't piss everyone off in the way that you said it. You said it in the cultish way rather than in the direct way, right? That wouldn't be, the right part, the right language for the cult, right? So everyone is, to some extent, an identity as a cult. Who are you? I'm the one that says this. Why? Why don't you just change that today? No, that's who I am. Why? Because that's who I was. Why? Well, because that's who I was. I was that way because that's the way my parents were, and so that's the way I am, right? And that's not me. Why isn't it you? Well, because it's not. Because that's not what the kind of thing I would say. Why not? Why don't you just start saying it? No, it's not authentic. Because I haven't repeated it 1,000 times. Because I didn't learn it from my great-grandfather. Because it's not our tradition. Well, why not, right? So it's, this is not a conversation that can happen inside the Lazaris cult. It can happen on the fringes only because it's public. Meaning rather than in the forum, and here would be another definite downer. In the forum, all of this would be negative ego. Right? Now, to someone listening who hasn't spent X number of years with Lazaris, sounds a bit weird, right? Because it is, right? But that's a wonderful defense, having been told by Lazaris that everything horrible is coming from negative ego, that the whole universe is happening wonderfully except you, right? This is Lazaris, right? The entire universe is in peace and harmony, blah, 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 except you, right? You're the only one struggling, doing this and all this. And the reason is your negative ego, right? It's the cause of every miserable possible thing imaginable. Well, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to accept it? Or are you going to say, how is a tornado a problem of negative ego, Lazaris? How is the dinosaur extinction a problem of negative ego? Or is that what you mean, right? If you're a dinosaur and you're now sizzling because of an asteroid, is that peace and harmony? Or what is that? Like the entire universe. Now, Lazaris has also talked about, right? So the entire universe is having this harmonious, peaceful, beautiful relationship with all that is except humanity. Right? Well, that kind of doesn't seem to say a lot of positive stuff about humanity. But then in Lazaris, The Complete Guide to Channeling, Barbara Marx Hubbard talks about what a luminous sense of humanity and feels the very best of humanity is coming through Lazaris. And then Lazaris is very anti the whole Christian, you're the scum of the world. But if we're the only thing not working in the entire multiverse, sounds a bit scummy, right? That isn't kind of critically gone into, unfortunately, in the way it deserves to be analyzed, right? Because Lazaris has also said that, this Earth body, there's a kind of a constellation between the Orions that apparently, are butchering slave drivers, and the Pleiadians and Lemurians, or what was it? Syrians and Pleiadians, right? So that kind of Orion came down to get sex slaves and robots and manipulate people out of fear to do various things. And then that was kind of mitigated or tempered. Let's just pretend for the moment that that's the gist of it. May or may not be, because there isn't a lot of dialogue to clarify things in the Lazaris protocol of communicating. There's just tons and tons of things that never got asked that would be obvious questions. But one of them is, I thought the whole universe was peaceful and harmonious. Now it's us and the Orions. So the whole universe is functioning peacefully except us. Oh, and then the Orions that had this influence. Okay, all right. So now it's us and the Orions. But then Lazaris has talked about all kinds of civilizations mightier, vaster and mightier than our own. That in the universe there are vast civilizations out there. Well, probably true, but let's look at the spread of probabilities, right? Now, the probability spread, wherever you are on the Earth, for example, you fly east, there's an equal amount of east to fly, there's an equal amount of west, wherever you are on the globe, right? If you're in Japan, you can fly east for as long as someone in New York or anywhere else, right? Wherever you are, there's an infinite degree of flying east, there's an infinite degree of flying west. It's just the physics, right, of reality. So I totally think that within the possibility field, right? First of all, everything is possible within the possibility field. And within the probability field, it is highly probable. Amongst all of the billions upon billions of planets that are conducive to our form of life, to some degree, that there are some planets that have civilizations that are vaster and more mightier than ours, to use Lazaris' words. Sure. And since we're always in the middle, within the multiverse, within the possibility of field, there are planets and civilizations that are piddling compared to our own, that are much weaker, whatever the antithesis of mighty is, right? So there are great civilizations, and there are, quasi-failing civilizations relative to our standard, which is just whatever it is, right? Wherever our standard is, like if we have $100, then everyone who has $10 is very poor relative to us, and everyone who has $1,000 is very rich, right? So it's just relative, right? So wherever we are, there are weaker and mightier, poorer and richer, more intelligent and less intelligent, more hostile and less hostile civilizations than our own. Right? Wherever we are in the probability field stretches out in both directions. Now, the implications of that is that there are that half of the life forms in the universe or the multiverse are less evolved, are in more pain, are less intelligent, are more destructive, whatever it is, and that half of them are moving in the other direction, more evolved, more mighty, more intelligent, whatever. And so how does that fit with the entire multiverse is functioning perfectly except us, right? Well, you could go outside of the physical set then, and you could say that, the entire multiverse, except for the little subset of physicality within all that is, of all that is, et cetera, that within physicality, that there's this pain and suffering, right? But what about the fractal nature of reality, right? What about the fact that the best way to understand a family is to fully understand the inner voices, the inner dialogues within an individual psyche that emerged out of that family? What about the fact that you can predict and discover and meet the family in the individual, and you can predict and discover the individual out of the family? Now, is that pattern not a fractal pattern that continues indefinitely? Right? I don't know, but as far as I can tell, and I have some question because I have some ignorance around the way physics changes at the subatomic level, right? That there are certain Newtonian laws that seem to take precedence and have influence on larger objects that don't have influence on smaller objects. So there do seem to be built into this fractal pattern of reality the phenomena of paradigm shifts or step changes. And so that is in our reality, that at certain thresholds or scales, the structure that seems most useful and relevant changes. And so since we've already discovered that in both directions, for example, the Big Bang is not obeying the laws of physics, that we can apply today, right? You ask a single scientist to get a tennis ball to disappear into nothingness, or to at least get as small as the size of a pea that supposedly the entire universe came from. Well, the scientists cannot get a single planet back into the size of a pea. The scientist can't get a single solar system into the size of a pea, a single galaxy, 5 or 10 galaxies, a million. They can't get anything down that small. But supposedly, poof, right? Reality appears. Well, it's a big leap of faith. You can't prove it. You can't recreate it. You can't even bring a single tennis ball back to the size of a pea. Right. But the entire universe apparently was that small. And then at a certain degree of smallness, it behaves completely different. So that we do have that kind of in our awareness, that there are these thresholds of change. So we could say then that there are certain laws, certain equations, and then there comes a big shift, and then there are certain laws and certain equations, and then there becomes a big shift, and there are certain laws and certain equations. And probably there's a refrain, much like a song. Why? Well, because songs have a refrain. Where did that come from? Where's this appeal of the refrain? She was coming round the mountain when she comes. She was coming round the mountain when she comes, when she comes. She was coming round the mountain. Right? Then you have a line, and then you come back to that. Why do people like a refrain, a chorus? Right? Why do they like it, right? Well, we're part of life. Life likes to have a certain amount of habits. How do you know? Because it does. Right? My hands are not just dissolving into tennis balls. Why not, right? It's their habit to stay hands. Why? Apparently they like staying hands, right? All the atoms in my hands could just suddenly change habit, right? The habit that's forming this hand could become a habit that forms a tennis ball. Then I would have one hand and one tennis ball. What's holding it into a habit? What is a habit? It's a repeat. It's a pattern that repeats. That's all a habit is. What's a refrain? It's a pattern that repeats. Right? Why do we sing a refrain? Because we like it. Why do hands stay hands? Perhaps for the same reason. They like it. So identity is simply the I, the structure that attaches, that identifies with a given pattern. We say, this is my pattern. Maybe a terrible pattern, but it's mine, right? Who cares, right? Well, the ego does. It's mine. It's my pattern. It's my toy. It's my this. It's my body. You can't touch my body without my permission, says the ego. Right? Without the ego, it isn't anyone's body. It's just energy and form that anyone can touch and do whatever with because there's no ego saying that's mine. Like an apple tree doesn't say, that's my apple. It's mine. The apple tree doesn't have an ego, right? So, but what is an ego? It is a consciousness that identifies with a given pattern. Well, what's a God? It's presumably, at least it's projected to be, a consciousness that identifies with a particular area of energy that is in a pattern. So the ego seems to be a fractal pattern. So if the ego is the source of all negativity, and of course Lazaris splits that into the positive and the negative ego. But one of the things you see very clearly whenever you divide the one is that the two halves are illusions, right? Meaning it's fine to pretend that the earth has a north and a south. How do you do it? You just draw a line in the middle, and you call this north, and you call this south. Now, you can pretend they're separate. People will, right? That's the north. It's not the south. That's the south. It's not the north. You can pretend it's separate. But is it? Right? Let's stop pretending. Let's get a giant laser beam and truly cut the world in half. Well, what happens? Well, they bang into each other at times, perhaps, right? They stop spinning. Their points in the spin where gravity is different because the axis isn't maintaining, right? If you serve half a tennis ball, it doesn't spin equally. The tips spin faster than the middle. The bits collapse. What happens to the oceans, right? Well, they pour into the molten core. What happens to the molten core? It cools down, right? It's no longer the Earth. As soon as you cut something in half, it no longer exists. There is no cutting something in half. There is no flower without roots. There are no roots without flowers. There is no north without south, and there is no positive without negative. So, the idea that there's a negative ego and a positive ego is just one of those illusions. It's one of those cuts. Right? That may be a useful cut, right? And here's what I mean. Life is changing. Life is moving forward. Certainly moving. If it's alive, it's moving, right? Breath. Now our life is foundationed, is built on the cycle of the breath. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. There is no exhale without inhale, and there is no inhale without exhale. It's a cycle. Now, what's a destructive interference with that cycle if you want to stay alive? Well, if you breathe out and then you say that breathing out is good and breathing in is evil or negative, then you try to breathe out some more. I want to be good, right? I don't want to be evil. Well, luckily, the body has its own reflexes. It knows you're a fool, right? And so it just breathes in, right? But this is very much like the compulsive dynamics of many human beings. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be angry, but I'm angry, and then I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be angry. That all energies have polarities. So, I don't want to be critical, I don't want to be cynical, I don't want to be skeptical, I don't want to have boundaries, I don't want to be hostile, I don't want to be angry, I don't want to be this, I want to be loving and kind and wonderful. Just give all the time, even if I don't have anything because I gave it all away yesterday, just give some more, right? I'm not going to receive even though I don't have any money because I gave it all away yesterday. I'm just going to do all this stuff. Well, what is the negative ego, right? The one that's afraid, the one that's, has shame, the one that's terrified and paranoid, right? That's the bad one, right? The one that has self-pity, the one that's self-importance to mitigate and medicate that self-pity, that's the negative ego. The positive ego is blah, 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 right? Now, there is a process, right? If you are inhaling and you've inhaled all you can, life dictates an exhale. If you are exhaling and have exhaled all you can, life dictates an inhale, right? For the cycle to continue, you've got to continue the momentum of the cycle as the cycle was designed, right? The lungs aren't designed to follow an exhale with an exhale with an exhale. They're designed to follow an inhale with an exhale with an inhale with an exhale, right? So wherever we are on our cycle, whether it's moving from the outer world to the inner world, then back to the outer world, or from our dream life to our outer dream life, to our inner dream life, to our outer dream life, or to making money, to spending money, to making money, to spending money, or to going to Lazaris workshops, to not going to Lazaris workshops, or getting interested in Lazaris and not interested in Lazaris, or trying to discover the heights of our unconditional love, to trying to discover the depths of our pain and trauma and shadow and whatever the polarity is, the cycle, whether it's the pendulum moving to the left or to the right, life is about the flow from the supposed top to the bottom, right? In other words, the Earth is in an orbit around the sun. So if it's been day for a while and it's coming on night, life dictates that night follow the day, not another day and then another day. Now, we could just stop the Earth's orbit, put all the nuclear bombs in one direction, hit it the other way, and just stop the Earth cold in its orbit so that it could be always day where we are, right? Well, sure, okay, it's just the end of life as we know it, right? Because all those nuclear bombs and all that radiation, and now we don't, now it's getting burning hot and the rains aren't moving around the weather system, and all kinds of weird, and the gravitational pull of the spin isn't working, because the spin is releasing us from gravity and the mass is pulling us to gravity, right? If you're on the edge of a ball and it's spinning really fast, you want to pull away. So part of our ability to get off out of the intensity of gravity is the spin, right? Now we can't crawl off the floor, right? So it's death, basically, to stop the cycle wherever it is. And whatever it is that we're considering is base, whether it's the manure that smells and is ugly and unlovable and all that, or the flower that I'm unworthy of or whatever and all that, the flower comes from the manure, right? If you're worthy of the manure, you're worthy of the flower that comes out of the manure. If you're worthy of the flower, you're worthy of the manure that grows it. It's part of a cycle, right? So if you want an ego and you want to look through a dualistic lens, there will be a negative ego, according to Lazaris, right? And there will be a positive ego, according to Lazaris. But can they function without one another? Lazaris has said, for example, that, referencing the Pareto principle, that only 2% of the people in a Lazaris workshop are, luminous and blah, 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 and the rest are, right? Okay, but does Jach make enough money without the 98% that come to workshops and don't grow and just keep coming back and flying around the country, giving money to concept synergy, right? If only 2 people came or 5 people came to a workshop, would there be workshops, right? So if the 98% that aren't enlightened or whatever it is Lazaris was referencing at the time disappeared, right? Because we don't want the negative, we just want the real seekers, right? Well, the real seekers probably don't need to go to a workshop, right? For one, the real seekers at a workshop, right, maybe can't pay the $30,000 fee for a weekend so that no one else has to attend, right? Or the $1,000 a event, several hundred people. Right? So maybe you need all those people who aren't getting it to keep coming back so that the 2% that are getting it don't go bankrupt. Well, then are they really the dimly lit, or are they the fuel that is burnt by the wick? I'm not sure you can separate. You can in your mind, I'm just not sure you can really do it. Can you really get rid of the negative ego? Not in any mathematical sense, right? Physics say that nothing is created or destroyed. It's only changed. Right? And if orchids are turning manure into flowers, and the positive ego is turning the negative territory of the negative ego into growth, if there was no negative ego to turn into growth, where would be the cycle of life? So, right. So while in the Lazaris forum, and I have been shut down in that domain for asking and exploring questions, this would all be shut up as negative ego. And nobody wants to be the only part of the universe that, is bad and the source of all problems and blah, 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 and everything wants to happen gracefully, etc., except your negative ego and all this. It isn't shut out in this space, right? Because this space is a public space. So in this space, and this used to happen in CompuServe, because Neil and several of the forum moderators didn't like kind of the shame, abuse, control dynamics that Penny and Jach and the Orlando gang, an odd name for people on a path to dominion. They didn't want the Orlando gang ganging up on people for asking questions or sharing their opinion, right? So Penny's response was to create a forum that only she and the gang could control, which they did, and proceeded to kick various people out of the forum if they didn't obey warnings. Right? But then people began going outside the forum and saying things, and that was terrifying to Concept Synergy, the idea that other people would have different points of view and have the ability to criticize as well as praise Lazaris, etc. Well, then they create this user agreement with anyone buying digital material from Concept Synergy that says you have to ask written permission to talk about Lazaris before talking about Lazaris anywhere on the internet. Well, to the ACLU, to people dealing with oppression and control and censorship throughout history, this sounds a lot like domination, sounds a lot like fear, sounds a lot like negative ego, right? Oh dear, right? It's just what people in power have always done to the extent that they can, right? To the extent that they can, statistically speaking, most people in power have tried to stop other people from doing the things that upset them. And usually the things that upset them are different than whatever they're doing, right? So if I'm a Christian, you should be a Christian. I don't want to be a Christian. Okay, I'll kill you. I'll cut off your feet. I'll rape you because you're not a Christian. You don't believe that killing is one of the deadly sins. Right? Why? Because I can. I've got a bigger armada. Got a gun, right? I can just click delete and you can't post on the forum anymore. Well, there you go. So this is also, I think, you could say this is horrible, right? How horrible that you spend all this money and take all this time believing Lazaris' teaching, and then you don't even have free speech as an enlightened one. Really? Lazaris says that you're enlightened, you're a shining one, that you are the map makers, but you don't even have free speech? Really? Interesting. These are and you see, but do you have one without the other, right? Lazaris will say that domination is the blah, 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 the end of the thing, right?